Welcome everyone. In this lecture, I will go over activity-based costing, which falls into syllabus area B of ACCA paper Performance Management. First of all, let me begin with a reference to the syllabus. After taking this lecture, you should be able to identify appropriate cost drivers under activity-based costing. You should also be able to calculate cost per driver and cost per unit using activity-based costing. Finally, you should be able to compare activity-based costing and traditional methods of overhead absorption costing based on production units, labor hours, or machine hours. So let's start with an introduction. Activity-based costing is one of the advanced or modern or specialist management accounting technique that has been developed mainly because of two reasons. First, the business environment has changed. And second, there are some limitations of absorption costing, which was traditionally used to determine full production cost. Therefore, before we understand the dynamics of activity-based costing, we need to recap some of the features of absorption costing and its limitations to understand the activity-based costing. So let's revise absorption costing. From your basic knowledge and fundamentals of cost and management accounting, you should know that under absorption costing, full production costs comprise direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. You must understand that direct material and direct labor, by their nature, are easily identifiable and traceable through material requisitions and payroll timesheet. The problem, however, lies with manufacturing overhead, which by their nature are not easily identifiable and traceable, and that's the definition of the manufacturing overheads. Now, the problem is to find out the proper amount of overheads to be assigned to each product, service, or a job. In order to resolve this problem, absorption costing has been developed as a method to assign overhead cost to each product, service, or a job. Now you must understand that under absorption costing, a predetermined overhead absorption rate is calculated as follows. So effectively, OAR equals estimated total amount of manufacturing overhead, and then we divide it by estimated total amount of allocation base. Now you should know that the allocation base is generally either the direct labor hours or machine hours. There is an underlying assumption that direct labor hours or machine hours drive the manufacturing overhead. That's why the overhead shall be assigned to product on the basis of machine hours or labor hours, which is the cost driver. So what are the problems with absorption costing? The assumptions of absorption costing make some sense in earlier periods where manufacturing plants and processes were more simple, they were more labor intensive, and the companies were involved in making few products, and the proportion of overheads was relatively less than the direct material cost or the direct labor cost. Now we need to ask this question to ourselves, that the business environment we are living in today, whether that is the same as of the prior periods. Whether you see that today companies are making few products, the processes are simple, are they labor intensive. So what we found is that today's business environment has changed, and nowadays manufacturing processes and the product companies are making are far more complex than the past. Now what that effectively resulted in, absorption costing results in inaccurate costing. Some of the product becomes overcosted, whereas some of the products becomes undercosted. So complex products are not allocated an adequate amount of overhead cost, whereas simple products gets too much. So simple products, in other words, becomes overcosted, whereas complex products becomes undercosted. Now, to understand more about the features of today's manufacturing plants and processes, what we must understand, as I told you, that today manufacturing plants and processes are more complex, they are more automated. We are into the era where we are automating every process and where robots are also involved. We are into computer-aided manufacturing and computer-aided designs and robotic manufacturing. And nowadays we are listening about 3D printing and 3D manufacturing and things like that. Today companies are involved in making more than one product. So as the customer demand more variety, so companies are making more than one versions of same product, and also companies are making multiple products. So we exist in a multi-product and variety environment. As I told you that today manufacturing plants and processes involve large amount of overhead cost. Definitely this automation and the focus on designing and the focus on marketing and focus on research and development and variety, all these end up in huge amount of overhead costs which today companies are incurring, which means that the labor and material becomes relatively small proportion as compared to the total overheads. And when labor especially is proportionately smaller amount of the total cost of the product, whereas overheads is the larger amount, then it is quite unfair to use the labor to apportion the manufacturing overhead cost. So that's a major problem. Can we still use direct labor as the basis for allocating or apportioning manufacturing overheads? The answer is no. We need to have some other base. So if we can't use one base, then what we should do? So when the manufacturing process is more complex, then we should use multiple allocation bases. It would be very unfair to use a single base to allocate all overheads. We should use multiple bases for different types of overheads. So in such situations, managers need to consider using activity-based costing. So what is activity-based costing? Activity-based costing is an alternative approach to allocate manufacturing overhead. Alternative to what? Alternative to absorption costing. Activity-based costing is an overhead cost allocation system, just like absorption costing, that allocates overhead to multiple activity cost pools and then assign the activity cost pools to product or services by means of cost drivers that represents the activities used. So for now, it is quite easy to understand that this is an alternative approach of absorbing overhead cost into the product. Now, in the next couple of slides, we'll learn about dynamics and we'll learn about the stages and the approach. But right now, we have established that because of changes in the business environment and because manufacturing processes and plants are becoming more complex, it will be still unfair to use direct labor as the allocation base. Rather, because the nature and amount of overhead is changed, so we should use different allocation bases for different overheads, and that multiple allocation based system, we are calling it activity-based costing. So let's understand the basic idea behind activity-based costing. The underlying rationale in activity-based costing is that product consume activities and activities consume resources. That's the cost. So in the past, we believed that product incurs cost. The activity-based costing believes that activities incurs the cost and product consume the activities. So there is an indirect link between the product and the cost, and that indirect link is the activity, and that's the reason the concept is named as activity-based costing. So therefore, product should be assigned cost based on activities they consume. So if there are two different products, and the two different products consume different types of activities, and they consume different types of activities in different quantities, then they should be assigned cost differently. So what we are effectively saying here is that products differ in their consumption of activities. There are few products, we can call them simple products, they consume less activities. And there are other products, and we can call them complex products, they require more activities. So few of the products may require designing, whereas the other products may not require designing. A few of the products may require, let's say, marketing, whereas few other products may not require marketing. Likewise, few products requires maybe quality control, whereas other products do not require quality control. So if the products differ in their consumption of activities, then we should assign cost based on those activities. So simple products should be assigned less cost, whereas complex products, because they consume more activities, they should be assigned more cost. So that's why it would be fair if overheads assigned to products based on their consumption of activities, and that is the basic idea behind activity-based costing. And that idea will then lead to realistic, accurate, and fair cost allocation, which has definitely implications for planning, controlling, and decision making. We'll discuss those implications in some of the later slides. So let's now understand the basic definitions. So we have already understood that activity-based costing is an approach for allocating overhead cost. The main concept here is an activity. So what is an activity? An activity is an event, transaction, action, or work sequence that causes a cost to be incurred in producing a product or providing a service. So material handling might be classified as an activity. Order processing is an activity, quality control is an activity, product design is an activity. So activity is an event, action, transaction, or work sequence that causes a cost to be incurred in producing a product or providing a service. So the third definition is of an activity cost pool. Now each activity incurs a cost. So if we combine all the cost which belongs to that activity and we combine them together, we are making an activity cost pool. So activity cost pool effectively is the overhead cost attributed to a distinct type of activity. For example, purchasing material, setting up machines. So if we add all the overhead costs that relates to the purchasing of material, we can call it activity cost pool of purchasing material. And if we add all the costs related to setting up machines, we can call it an activity cost pool of setting up machines. Another very important definition, and that is the cost driver. So what drives the cost? We have a basic understanding of it in the traditional system when we say that labor hours or machine hours drive the cost. So what effectively is a cost driver? A cost driver is any factor or activity that has a direct cause and effect relationship with the resources consumed. So what causes the cost to be incurred? So what causes purchasing material cost to be incurred? What causes ordering cost to be incurred? What causes setting up machine cost to be incurred? So for example, ordering cost may be driven by number of orders. So more order means more ordering cost, less order means less ordering cost. So number of orders actually causes the ordering cost to be higher or lower. That's why we are calling number of orders as cost driver for ordering cost. So that's the concept of a cost driver. So let's now understand the mechanics of ABC. Activity-based costing allocates overhead costs in two stages. Stage 1, where overhead costs are allocated to activity cost pools. And stage 2, the overhead costs are allocated to the cost pools using cost drivers. So as we understand that products are assigned cost on the basis of activities, so activity and the activity cost pool is a central link. So first of all, we will allocate overhead cost to the activity cost pools, and from those activity cost pools we will charge cost to the product based on relevant cost drivers. Now let's understand this diagrammatically. So here we have this overhead costs. So on the top you can see. So the first stage would be allocating these overhead costs to the activity cost pool. So you can see that this is the first stage where we are allocating cost to the different activity cost pools. So there are 4 activity cost pools mentioned here. One is the purchasing, the other is storing, and then is machining and supervising. Traditionally, overhead costs are arranged in the form of the departmental overhead cost. But here in activity-based costing system, we have to allocate the total overhead cost to the different activity cost pools. In a complex manufacturing environment, there will be more cost pools. In a simple manufacturing environment, there will be less cost pools. But anyways, the first step is to allocate overhead cost to the different cost pools. So you can say this is stage 1. Now once we allocate overhead cost to the activity cost pools, then we have to trace then these overheads to the products. So this is stage 2, where we allocate cost from the cost pools to the products. So here you can see at the bottom are the 2 products, axle and the steering wheels. And we do this through appropriate cost drivers. So for example, the cost from the activity cost pool of purchasing shall be assigned to the 2 products, axles and steering wheels, based on the number of purchase orders. So number of purchase order is the cost driver here in this example, through which we assign purchasing cost to the 2 products. Likewise, the storing cost pools can be assigned to the 2 products on the basis of amount of square footage. So here the amount of square footage is the relevant cost driver for assigning storage cost to the 2 product, axle and steering wheels. Likewise, machining costs can be allocated to axles and steering wheels based on the number of machine hours, which is the relevant cost driver. And likewise, supervising cost is allocated to the 2 products, axles and steering wheels, based on number of employees, which is the relevant cost driver. So stage 1, allocate overhead costs to the cost pools. Stage 2, allocate cost from the cost pools to the product based on relevant cost drivers. So for the ease of application, the 2 stages can then be further understood as 4 steps which may be required for effectively implementing activity-based costing in an organization. So the first stage, and that is more an applied stage, a practical stage, where you as a consultant go to the company and set the system, develop the system. So the first step in the implementation of activity-based costing is to identify activities and activity cost pools and cost drivers. The second step would then be to allocate total manufacturing overhead cost to the appropriate activity cost pools. And this is exactly what we learned in the previous slide. The third step would be to compute the overhead absorption rate for each activity cost pool, and then final step would be to assign overhead cost for each cost pool to the product using the overhead rates. So here the first step is related to the system design and needs to be implemented when ABC is implemented for the first time. Through consultation with the top management, ABC implementation team shall identify activities, activity cost pools, and cost drivers. Practically speaking, in ABC, there will be multiple activities, multiple activity cost pools, and multiple cost drivers. The second step involves arbitrary apportionment of the total manufacturing overheads to the relevant activity cost pools. This is also an applied step in which the members of the ABC implementation team shall consult with top management and all those who are responsible for and having experience of managing overheads based on their perception of the relative proportion of overheads in different activities. Overheads will be apportioned to the activity cost pools. Third and fourth steps, which are normally examined in the exam paper. The first two steps are not normally examined. Third and fourth steps, which are normally examined in the exam paper, involves calculating rates and applying rates. Practically, multiple overhead absorption rates will be calculated for each activity cost pool and then applied to each product based on relevant cost drivers. So here again, you can see we have overheads on the top and we have certain activity cost pools. Here we have ordering and receiving material cost pool, setting a machine cost pool, machining cost pool, assembly cost pool, inspecting and testing cost pool, painting cost pool, and supervising cost pool. So our first job would be definitely to identify various activities and activity cost pools and cost drivers. So here let's say the designer of the system, the ABC implementation team, has come up with these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 activity cost pools, and they come up with the 7 drivers of these activity cost pools. So once we establish this, then the next step would be to assign overhead costs to the activity cost pools, and then from activity cost pools we need to assign costs to the products based on the cost drivers, which is step 1, 2, 3, 4. Once it is done, we are then able to calculate the amount of overheads to be absorbed to a product. So once we successfully applied the steps which were just mentioned in the previous slide, then it will result into better costing. So we need to understand the implications of activity-based costing. Activity-based costing will mainly result in accurate costing, and that's why sometimes it is also named as accurate, better costing. So the most important implication which you should discuss if the question comes in the exam, the discursive question comes in the exam, is that activity-based costing will result in more accurate product costing. Now, how it results in more accurate product costing? Because it uses more cost pool to assign overhead costs. The system is more sophisticated. The system is more detailed, because instead of making one cost pool and one cost driver, the system uses multiple cost pools and multiple drivers, and then calculate multiple rates and then apply those rates multiple times. So the system is more detailed and more sophisticated rather than absorption costing. And when you add more detail to something, it becomes more accurate. So that logic is very simple. So because we have more knowledge about the cost, more detailed knowledge about the cost and what drives the cost, so effectively another implication of activity-based costing is that as a manager we have enhanced control over overhead costs. And definitely once we have a better idea about cost, we can plan the cost better, we can control the cost better, and we can make various decisions better through the detailed knowledge of the cost which activity-based costing gives us. Another thing we need to understand is that activity-based costing actually overhead costs are shifted from high volume product to the low volume products. So initially in the initial slides I told you that if we don't apply activity-based costing, some of the products will be overcosted and some of the products will be undercosted. So activity-based costing actually fixes that thing, and activity-based costing shifts the cost from the simple product to the complex product, that shift the cost from the high volume product to the low volume product. Again, the rationale is that low volume product often requires more special handling and the more complex. So assigning overhead costs using activity-based costing will usually increase the cost per unit of low volume product, which are assumed to be more complex. So after understanding the implications, we need to understand the limitations of activity-based costing as well. Now that's the limitation with most of the modern techniques, most of the contemporary techniques. They can be expensive to use. Obviously, if you are providing more detail to the overheads, and you are actually spending too much time on identifying activities, a lot of people are involved, a lot of resources are required, a lot of time is required, so it is not easy to and economic to apply activity-based costing. So that's one of the limitations, that activity-based costing can be expensive. There could be more cost involved in implementing activity-based costing, and sometimes it is the benefit of implementing activity-based costing might not be justifying the cost involved, and that's one of the limitations. Second, though activity-based costing promises to remove all the arbitrary allocations, and it actually promises to be more accurate and less arbitrary in the application of overhead to the product, but still there are some arbitrary allocations, especially when you're making different cost pools. Then still within the cost pool there are so many different cost items, and using one cost driver for all the multiple items within one cost pool may still be not accurate and still requires arbitrary allocations. And again, there is a lot of subjectivity, especially in the initial phases when you are defining activities and activity cost pools, and you are arbitrarily allocating different overheads to the activity cost pool. There's a lot of subjectivity involved into the process, which is one of the limitations of activity-based costing. After understanding the implications and limitations of the activity-based costing, which helps you in the discursive questions if they appear in the exam, one of the things which this paper of performance management is unique and which is required by the students at this level is that the student should be able to apply the concept in a different context. So let's understand ABC in context. So when we say context, normally when we talk about the different cost accounting concepts and management accounting concepts, we generally assume by default the context of a manufacturing business. But it doesn't mean that cost accounting and management accounting concepts cannot be applied to the non-manufacturing businesses, or maybe in other forms of businesses. That includes the public sector, because normally we assume the private sector in our examples. So what we're saying here is that in addition to the manufacturing business, ABC can also be applied to the public sector and service industries, and students should mentally prepare to comprehend the question that may be set by the examiner in a different scenario, because normally an exam question is given in the context of manufacturing business, where students are required to calculate the product cost and margins. However, examiner may ask to apply the principles of activity-based costing in a different context. Now, you should remember that while principles and the mechanism remain the same, you should understand the importance of applying ABC in that context. So, effectively, the process and the stages and the steps remain the same, but you may be required to discuss about the uniqueness of that context and the importance of the concept in that particular context. So let's understand something about activity-based costing in public sector. In case of public sector, ABC is particularly important as that will help governments to allocate funds more efficiently to areas where they provide the greatest benefits. Now remember that activity-based costing allocates cost, in that case of public sector, allocate funds to the product. So in the case of public sector, you can say to different provinces, or the different counties on the basis of the activities. So those areas where more activities required, the government should be allocating more funds. ABC may help to reduce the amount of overall government spending and to provide greater transparency so taxpayers can see where their money is being spent. So you can relate this concept of transparency to the details about the cost. I told you that activity-based costing gives you more detailed idea about the cost. So we know the different cost pools, we know what drives the cost, we understand the cost well, and that understanding of the cost gives us a better control over the cost and helps us in better planning and decision making. So the same applies to the government sector. Activity-based costing gives more transparency in the cost, more control over the cost by getting an idea of what drives the cost. So ABC is especially useful in helping public sector bodies assess more the cost of the services they provide. So that's the different features of the importance of activity-based costing in the public sector. So after understanding the basic idea and the stages and the processes, as well as the implications and limitations of the concept, so let's start with understanding what will be examined and what you are required to do through some demonstration questions as well. So I will be going through this section objective-wise. In the first slide, I told you there are three main objectives. The first objective is to identify appropriate cost drivers under ABC. So in multiple choice question or in an objective type case, you may come up with a question where you need to identify appropriate cost driver under activity-based costing. Now remember, identifying relevant cost driver is an applied step that can be performed with the consultation of the management of the company. So practically, if you go to the company and you are trying to implement activity-based costing, and that's why I'm saying this is an applied step, you need to consult with the top management. You can't do it on your own. However, once you are in an exam, the examiner might ask you to identify a appropriate cost driver by giving a list of the possible cost drivers, and then you should be able to relate the activity with the cost driver. So practically, those who are responsible for and have experience of managing overheads are in a better position to explain what drives cost. However, as a general principle, cost drivers and activity cost pools should be correlated. In exam questions, a student may be required to choose cost driver from various options for a cost pool. One must make sure that the driver identified shall have direct cause and effect relationship with the resources consumed by that activity cost pool. So that's the key. For example, an appropriate cost driver for setup related cost may be batch size or number of setups. Large batch size means a smaller number of production runs. Now for you, what I did is I just collected some of the activities and the relevant cost driver that will give you some idea of the relevant cost driver for the different activities. This list is non-exhaustive. There could be more setup. There could be more activities and more cost drivers, but that will give you enough idea. Now, for example, setup cost, as I already told you, is driven by number of setups, a number of production runs, or number of batches. Quality control is driven by number of inspections. Number of design could drive the designing cost. Procurement cost could be driven by number of purchase order. More orders means more procurement cost. Likewise, more deliveries means more delivery costs. Supervision cost could be driven by number of site visits. Planning related cost could be driven by number of planning documents. Machine related cost could be driven by number of machine hours. Catering cost, number of meals served. Customer support service, number of customers. Order processing, number of orders. Assembling units, number of units. Supporting direct labor, number of direct labor hours. machine processing, number of machine hours, product testing, number of testing hours. So this learning objective is quite straightforward. In a question, you will be asked to identify relevant cost driver. You put in your mind that cost driver has to be relevant. It has to be related to the activity you are applying for, and it must have the direct cause and effect relationship with that activity. So that's the key to choose a relevant cost driver. Now the second learning objective is to calculate cost per driver and cost per unit using the principles of activity-based costing. Now once a appropriate cost driver has been identified, calculating overhead cost per driver and per unit cost becomes relatively straightforward job. Now, in order to calculate cost per driver, all you need to do is to divide the overhead cost for the relevant activity cost pool by its relevant cost driver. Yes, simple. Divide the overhead cost by relevant driver to drive the cost of particular activity by its relevant driver. And there is a formula if you want to calculate cost per driver, and we can call it overhead absorption rate for the activity cost pool. Simply divide overhead cost by the cost driver. For cost per unit, then you have to multiply the rate with the consumption of that activity. Now let me demonstrate both of these concepts, cost per driver and cost per unit, through a demonstration question. Now this is the demonstration question we are doing now. In this question, there is a company called Green Thumb, and that is a small gardening service that uses activity-based costing to estimate cost for pricing and other purposes. The proprietor of the company believes that costs are driven primarily by the size of customer lawns, the size of customer garden beds, and the distance to travel to customers, and the number of customers. So there are 4 drivers. In addition, the cost of maintaining garden beds depends on whether the beds are low maintenance beds or high maintenance beds. Accordingly, the company used 5 activity cost pools listed below. So these are the 5 activity cost pools. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 activity cost pools. Now the first pool is caring for lawn. Now caring for lawn is driven by square feet of lawn. So more square feet of lawn means more caring cost for the lawn. Caring for garden beds, if they are low maintenance, is driven by square feet of low maintenance beds, and caring for garden beds, if they are high maintenance, is driven by square feet of high maintenance beds. Travel to jobs, the cost related to traveling to jobs is driven by miles traveled, and customer billing and service is driven by number of customers. Now here we have some data. The company has already completed its first stage allocation. Now first stage allocation means the company has assigned overhead cost to the activity cost pools. So after assigning overhead cost to the cost pool, these are the results. So this is the activity cost pool for caring for lawn. This is the activity cost pool for caring for garden beds, low maintenance. This is the activity cost pool for caring for garden beds, high maintenance, and this is the activity cost pool for travel to jobs, and this is the activity cost pool to customer billing and service. So the company has already performed the first stage allocations. The company has apportioned the overhead cost to the cost pools, and now what you're required to calculate, you are required to calculate the activity rates. So we don't need to do the second stage. We only are required to calculate the activity rate. Now remember, in the last slide I told you that activity rate will be calculated by dividing the overhead cost by the cost driver. So here in this question we are given information about the activity, expected activity, which is an activity measure or which is the cost driver. So if we divide the overhead cost by the total of that activity measure, so 72,000 divided by 1,50,000, so that gives us an activity rate, and that is 0.4 0.48 per square feet. So we call this an activity rate. So what we do is we divide overhead cost by the total of relevant cost driver. So for caring for beds, low maintenance, we need to divide 26,400 by 20,000. So in this way we get a rate of 1.32 per square feet of low maintenance beds, And if I divide 41,400 by 15,000, the rate would be 2.76. And if I divide 3250 by 12,500, the rate would be 0.26. This time it would be per miles because the activity measure is in miles. And if I divide 8750 by 25, I get 350 per customer, because the activity measure is mentioned in customers. The rest of the activity measures were mentioned in square feet. So these are the 5 activity rates we computed. So this is fairly simple, straightforward. Divide the total of the activity cost pool by the total of the activity measure if you want to calculate activity rate. Okay, in order to understand the cost per unit, let's have a look at another demonstration question. So this time we're given rates. So in the previous demonstration question, we calculated rates by dividing the total of activity cost pool by the total of activity measure. And then now in this question, we are applying these rates to calculate cost per unit, which is the part of our learning objective 2. So in this question, we have a company called Thermal Rising, and they make paragliders for sale through specialty sporting goods stores. The company has ordered a standard paraglider model, but also makes custom designed paragliders. Management has designed an activity-based costing system with the following activity. So you see there are 4 cost pools, and then there are 4 rates. So we bypass the first step. We are given activity rates. And then we are given some information about the 2 products, standard and custom, and their activity measures in terms of the number of products, number of orders, number of custom design, labor hours, selling price, material cost, and the direct labor rate. Now the requirement is, using activity-based costing, compute unit cost of standard and custom. So the requirement is compute So the requirement is to compute unit cost of standard and custom using activity-based costing. So let me copy that requirement here. So the requirement is to calculate cost per unit of standard and custom. Now, in order to calculate cost per unit, we first of all need the material cost and labor cost. So I'm just highlighting some of the information about material and labor cost. So first of all, we need to capture material cost. The material cost is 564 for standard and 634 for custom. There is a small omission here, so please note it down, 634. So I'm just copying that information here. So I'm just copying the material cost, direct material. So that is given as 564 and 634. The next information I need is of direct labor. So I need to understand the information about direct labor. Now regarding direct labor, it says that for standard they need 26.35 hours per glider, and for custom 28 hours. The hourly rate is given as 19.50 hours. So based on this information, we calculate labor per unit as 26.35, which is the hours required per unit of standard, times 19.5, which is the rate of labor. So that equals to 513.825. For custom, this calculation would be like 28 hours times 19.5 per hour. So that equals 546. Now this is straightforward because that doesn't belong to activity-based costing. We just added the per unit cost of material and per unit cost of labor. Now we need to add manufacturing overheads into that. So I'm just writing manufacturing overheads. Now from the question we can note that there are 4 major activity cost pools. So we need to note it down. We can ignore the last one, customer service, because it doesn't relate to the product, it relates to a customer. So effectively, product related activities are 3: supporting direct labor, order processing, and custom design processing. So let me just copy them here. Supporting direct labor, order processing, and custom design processing. So now we need to calculate their amounts. Now for supporting direct labor, the rate is 26, as we can see here, and we need to multiply this rate with the hours required. We already know the hours, 26.35 and 28. So we need to multiply 26.35 with the rate for supporting direct labor, and that will make it 685.1, and then we need to multiply 28, which is the hours per unit of custom, with the rate of supporting direct labor, which is 26, and that makes it 2728. So note it down. What we're doing is we're multiplying the activity rate with the consumption of that activity. So by multiplying the rate with the consumption of activity, we're calculating the amount to be charged per unit of the product. The same we repeat for order processing. Now for order processing, the rate is 284 per order. Now the consumption of activity is that for standard there are only 1 order, and for custom there are 3 orders. So we need to multiply 284 with 1 and 3 respectively. So 284 multiplied by 1. Now here we need to divide this by 20 as well. The reason being, if we multiply 284 with 1, that will be the total order processing cost. Now we need to calculate per unit, so that's why we need to divide it by 20. So in that way this equals to 14.2, and for custom we get 284 multiplied by 3. There are 3 orders for making all customs, and there are 3 units as well. So effectively this equals 284. Now for custom design processing, the rate is 186 per custom design. Now as per the question, there is no design of standard and there are 3 designs of customs. So that means none will be charged to the standard, whereas 3 multiplied by 186, so 186 multiplied by 3, and that will be divided by 3 as well, because we need to calculate per unit, and per unit would be the same as 186. So this is how we calculate, how we charge overheads to the products based on the rates. Now as a final step, we need to add all these costs, so we get the final answer, because our requirement was to calculate cost per unit of standard and custom. So if we add them together, that equals 1777.125, and for custom this is 2378. So this is how we calculate cost per unit. So we're done now with the learning objective 2, where we are required to calculate cost per driver and per unit using activity-based costing. So through demonstration question, I show you both how to calculate cost per driver, which is effectively an activity rate, and how to calculate cost per unit, which is multiplying that activity rate with the consumption of the relevant activity and making it part of the product cost. Now, the final learning objective mentioned is to compare activity-based costing and absorption costing. Now, here are some points. I will be discussing this, and you could be required to reflect upon that in a discussion question or in an objective type question. So the first thing is that in absorption costing, the initial allocation and apportionment is to cost center. I told you earlier as well that in absorption costing we allocate overhead cost to the departments rather than activity, whereas in activity-based costing we allocate cost to the activities rather than the cost centers. Now the second point is that absorption of overheads of each cost center is based on volume of output, and that volume of output is either the number of labor hours or number of machine hours. However, in the case of activity-based costing, absorption of overhead of each cost pool is based on the driver that causes the cost to vary. So here we have multiple pools and multiple drivers. Third point, many different types of costs for a particular cost center are included in the blanket overhead absorption rate of that department. So because we allocate overhead costs to the departments, so all the costs related to one department are added together and they are divided then by the labor hours or machine hours by that particular department. So effectively we are grouping all costs and we are dividing them by one activity by year, whereas only cost for a particular activity will be included in the relevant cost pool in case of activity-based costing. So then, since costs are assumed to depend on the volume of output, limited information is provided to the management about ways to reduce cost. Whereas in activity-based costing, because we have a greater idea of what drives costs, so we are in a position to control the cost in a better way. Absorption costing is relatively straightforward. There is one pool, one rate, one application, and we are done. Whereas activity-based costing is relatively large project, is relatively complex, multiple pools, multiple rates, multiple drivers, and then multiple applications. So it is lengthy, time-consuming, and complex.